It all began when I was just 9 years old, and my mom Maria married a man named Harvey Henderson. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal to me. I was living with my dad in a different state, and Harvey was just some man my mom had chosen to spend her life with. My dad was my everything. He made me laugh, he was always there when I needed him, and he made me feel safe. But everything changed when I turned 12. That year, my dad passed away, and my world took a turn I never could have imagined. After the funeral, I moved in with my mom and Harvey. They lived in a small, quiet town, and it felt like I had been thrown into a life that didn't fit me. I was grieving, lost, and angry at the world around me. My mom was always busy with work, spending long hours away, and we didn't have much of a relationship. She was physically present, but emotionally, I felt completely alone. I started acting out, sneaking out late at night, hanging out with the wrong crowd, and making decisions I'm not proud of. My mom either didn't notice or didn't know how to handle me. Harvey, however, noticed everything. He'd ask if I was okay, offer me money when I needed it, or surprise me with small gifts like a new necklace or phone. He told me I deserved nice things. At first, I thought he was just being kind, but looking back now, I realize it was something else entirely. I wish I could go back and change everything, but I can't. And now I feel trapped in the mess my life has become. I missed my dad more than I could ever put into words. He wasn't perfect, but he was my anchor. He had a way of making everything seem okay, even when it wasn't. I remember how he used to wake me up early on Saturdays to make pancakes, letting me flip them even though I always messed it up. We'd laugh about it. Or how he'd read the same bedtime story to me for years because I refused to choose a new one. At the time, those moments seemed small, but now they mean everything to me. They're what I cling to. When he died, it felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. One day, I had a dad who hugged me, told me he loved me, and promised we'd visit the amusement park that summer. The next day, he was gone. I don't even remember much of the funeral, just the numbness I felt, sitting in my room staring at the walls, wishing it was all a bad dream. Then I had to leave the only home I'd ever known and move to this stifling little town to live with my mom and her husband. Nothing about it felt right. I didn't know anyone. The house didn't feel like home, and my mom felt like a stranger. She called herself busy, but the truth was she didn't know how to be there for me. In those first few months after I moved in, I spent nights scrolling through old photos of my dad and me, crying until my eyes ached. My mom never came to check on me. She'd leave for work early and come home late, leaving me alone most of the time. That's when I started spiraling. Staying out late became my way of escaping the house and avoiding thoughts of my dad. The people I began spending time with weren't exactly the best influences. They didn't care about my sadness or anger. They just wanted to have fun. By fun, I mean drinking, partying, and doing things we shouldn't have been doing. It was easy to fall into that crowd. It helped drown out the pain, even if only for a little while. I started skipping school too. What was the point? My mom didn't seem to notice. Maria, my mom, was always working. I know now that she was doing it for us, but at the time, it didn't feel that way. She'd come home exhausted, barely speak to me, and go straight to bed. If I stayed out late, she wouldn't ask where I'd been. If I failed a test, she wouldn't ask why. It felt like she didn't care, even though I understand now that she just didn't know how to deal with me. And then there was Harvey. At first, he seemed kind. He'd ask about my day or tell me not to be too hard on myself. One time, after I got caught skipping school, he didn't yell like I expected. Instead, he sat me down and asked what was going on. I didn't know what to say, and he didn't push. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here," he said. He started doing small things that I thought were sweet. If I mentioned liking something, he'd buy it for me. Once, I told him I loved a necklace I saw online, and 2 days later, it was sitting on my dresser. Sometimes, he'd leave me notes with messages like, "You're doing great," or "Don't let the world get you down." Compared to how distant my mom was, his attention felt like a lifeline. For a while, I even began to look up to him, thinking he genuinely cared. He made sure there was dinner on the table when my mom worked late and helped me with my homework when I struggled. I convinced myself he was just trying to be a good stepdad. But looking back now, I see how calculated it all was. He wasn't just being kind. He was finding ways to make me trust him, to make me depend on him. At the time, I didn't see it for what it really was. Slowly but surely, he was filling the gap my dad had left behind, the space my mom never even tried to occupy. For a while, I let him. I didn't recognize the signs or question his actions. I just thought, finally, someone sees me. At first, I didn't give much thought to Harvey's behavior. I convinced myself he was just being a nice stepdad, stepping into a role when my mom wasn't around. But as time went on, things started to feel different. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. A compliment here, a touch there. It seemed harmless, but something about it felt strange. One of the first moments that stood out was in the kitchen. I was making a sandwich when Harvey walked in, smiled, and said, "You're growing up so beautifully, Leslie." "Do you know that?" I froze for a moment. No one had ever said anything like that to me before, and I didn't know how to react. I laughed awkwardly, unsure of what to do, while he just stood there, looking at me. It wasn't so much the words themselves, but the way he said them. They made my stomach twist uncomfortably, but I brushed it off. Then there were the hugs. At first I didn't think much of them. It's normal for a stepdad to hug his stepdaughter, right? But Harvey's hugs didn't feel normal. They lingered just a little too long, and his hands would rest on my back for longer than they should. Sometimes they slid slightly lower, making me uneasy. I told myself I was imagining it, that he didn't mean anything by it, but deep down, it didn't feel right. There were other moments too, like when he'd brush the hair out of my face. It sounds like nothing, but it didn't feel that way. His hand would rest on my cheek longer than necessary, and the way he looked at me made me want to pull away. But I didn't. I didn't know how to react or what to say. I didn't want to make a scene or accuse him of something I wasn't even sure about. Harvey had a way of making me feel special. He'd listen intently when I talked about school or the things I enjoyed. He'd laugh at my jokes, even when they weren't funny. Then there were the gifts. At first, they were small, like a notebook for school or my favorite snacks. But over time, they became bigger. One day he bought me a delicate gold necklace with a tiny heart pendant. "It's just because," he said. "You deserve something nice." Not long after that, he gave me a new phone. My old one was cracked and barely worked. I'd been begging my mom for months to replace it, but she always said we couldn't afford it. One day, Harvey handed me a sleek, brand new phone. "You need something reliable," he said. "I want you to be able to call me if you ever need anything." I was stunned. On one hand, I was thrilled. None of my friends had a phone that nice. But on the other hand, it felt off. Why would he spend so much money on me? I hadn't even asked for it. When my mom found out, she just said, "Well, that was generous of him," and went back to whatever she was doing. Over time, I started to rely on Harvey. When my mom was too busy to notice me, he always did. He made me feel seen. I began telling him things I didn't share with anyone else, like how much I missed my dad or how I felt like I didn't belong anywhere. He'd listen and say things like, "You're stronger than you realize," or "I'm always here for you, Leslie." It felt good to hear those words. It felt good to have someone care. But there was always this nagging feeling I couldn't shake. Every time he touched my shoulder or gave me one of those long hugs, my stomach would knot. I'd wonder, is this normal? Am I overthinking? But I stayed quiet. I didn't want to ruin the one connection I felt I had. That's what made it so confusing. I craved his attention, but at the same time, it made me uncomfortable. I felt like I was walking a tightrope, unsure whether to lean into his kindness or distance myself from the way it made me feel. The more I thought about it, the more trapped I felt. He was the only person who seemed to care about me, but the way he cared didn't always feel right. Then, one night, something happened that I'll never forget, no matter how much I want to. Maria had taken an extra shift at work, so it was just me and Harvey at home. He asked if I needed help with my math homework. It wasn't unusual. He'd been helping me with schoolwork for months. I didn't think twice, so I said yes. We sat at the dining table with papers spread out, calculators and pencils in hand. I struggled with a problem, and he leaned in close, so close I could feel his breath on my cheek. "You're really smart, Leslie," he said softly. "You just don't give yourself enough credit." He placed his hand on mine, supposedly to guide me through the equation, but his touch lingered. His thumb brushed against my skin gently. I froze, unsure what to say or do. He looked at me, his eyes locking onto mine. "You're so special," he whispered. Before I could process what was happening, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a quick peck or a fatherly gesture. It was something entirely different. My mind raced. I wanted to pull away, to yell, to ask what he thought he was doing, but I didn't. I just sat there stunned. When he pulled back, he said, "I love you, Leslie. You know that, right? This is our secret." His words felt heavy, suffocating. I didn't know how to respond. He told me I made him feel alive, that I was the one thing in his life that brought him happiness. He said it like it was a compliment, like I should feel honored. But inside, I felt sick. After that night, everything changed. Harvey began finding more excuses to be alone with me. He'd offer to drive me places or make sure we were alone in the house when Maria was at work. Each time he'd remind me this was about love, that what we had was special. He promised to wait for me, saying that once I turned 18 we could be together officially. It was so twisted, but I didn't have the words to explain how I felt. I despised what was happening, but I also loathed myself for the part of me that felt validated. For so long I had felt invisible, unloved and undeserving, and Harvey made me feel noticed, but at such a terrible cost. Each time it happened, I'd lie awake replaying everything in my head. I'd tell myself it wasn't my fault, that I didn't ask for any of this. But then I'd think about how I hadn't stopped it either, and that guilt ate away at me. Then came the filming. The first time, Harvey told me it was for us, a private way to preserve how much we loved each other. I didn't want to do it, but he had a way of making it seem like saying no wasn't an option. "It's just for us, Leslie," he said. "No one will ever see it. It's our little piece of forever." I hated every second of it, but I didn't stop him. The videos became his way of keeping control over me. Anytime I hesitated or tried to pull away, he'd bring them up. "You wouldn't want anyone to see these, would you?" he'd say with a smirk, like he was joking. But I knew he wasn't. It was his way of ensuring I couldn't leave or tell anyone. I started feeling like I was suffocating. I couldn't go to my mom. She'd never believe me. And even if she did, what could she do? Harvey had perfected the role of the ideal husband and stepfather. No one would ever suspect him of doing what he was doing. I couldn't tell my friends either. How could I even begin to explain that my stepdad claimed to love me and that I felt too weak to stop him? The worst part was how isolated I became. The more time I spent with Harvey, the more he pulled me away from everyone else. He made me believe no one else would understand, that no one else could care for me the way he did. And part of me believed him. I was so deeply under his control that I didn't know how to escape. Even now, his words echo in my mind. "This is love, Leslie. No one will ever love you like I do." It's a lie, but it's a lie I lived with for far too long. The weight of it still crushes me. One evening, while Maria was working late again, I sat in my room scrolling through my phone, trying to avoid my thoughts. Harvey knocked softly on the door before stepping in. "Hey," he said, his voice calm and comforting. "You've been in here all day. Want to come watch a movie? It might cheer you up." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to tell him no, to stay alone. But I felt guilty. He always seemed to be trying to help me, or at least that's what I convinced myself back then. So I agreed. I followed him to the living room where he'd already set up the couch with blankets and snacks. It seemed innocent enough, like he was just trying to make me feel better. We started watching an old movie, but I barely paid attention. I stared at the screen, my mind drifting elsewhere. Harvey sat close to me. Too close, but I tried not to notice. About halfway through the movie, he draped a blanket over both of us and put his arm around my shoulders. I froze for a second, but told myself it wasn't a big deal. I even leaned into him slightly, thinking maybe this was what a normal family felt like. Then he started stroking my hair, his fingers moving gently. "You're so beautiful, Leslie," he murmured, his voice soft, almost a whisper. My stomach flipped. I didn't know how to respond, so I said nothing. He tilted my face toward him, his hand resting lightly on my cheek. "You know how much I care about you, right?" he asked, his eyes searching mine, waiting for a response. I nodded, but I felt trapped. His gaze didn't waver, and before I could process what was happening, he kissed me. It wasn't a quick peck on the cheek or forehead. It was something entirely different. I pulled back slightly, but he held my face gently in his hands. "It's okay," he said. "You don't have to be scared. I'd never hurt you." My heart pounded in my chest. I felt paralyzed, unsure of what to do. He kissed me again. This time, I didn't pull away. I didn't lean in either. I just froze. He kept whispering to me, telling me how special I was, how much I meant to him. His hands moved cautiously, testing boundaries. I wanted to tell him to stop, but the words wouldn't come out. Part of me was terrified, but another part felt like I owed him this. He'd been so kind, so patient with me. He had listened when no one else did, helped me when I thought no one cared. I told myself this was what love looked like, even though deep down I knew it wasn't. Things escalated quickly after that. He reassured me, saying, "This is just between us. It's our secret." He made it sound like something sacred, something meaningful. and I let it happen. I don't know why I didn't scream or push him away. Maybe I was afraid of what would happen if I did. Maybe I just didn't know how to handle it at all. When it was over, I felt numb. I sat there on the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around myself, staring at the TV like nothing had happened. Harvey sat beside me, his arm resting on the back of the couch, acting as though everything was normal. "You're amazing, Leslie. I'm so lucky to have you," he said, turning to look at me. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I felt like I had crossed a line I could never return from. At the same time, I felt trapped. He had been the only person who made me feel like I mattered, and now I didn't know how to look at him or myself the same way again. Not long after that night on the couch, things took another turn, one I hadn't anticipated. By then, Harvey had started finding more ways to be alone with me. He'd come into my room, pretending to check on me, or offer to take me out for drives when Maria was at work. Each time, he'd remind me how much he cared, how much he loved me, and every time I felt more and more trapped. One afternoon, while Maria was on another long shift, Harvey suggested we hang out in his office. "It's quieter in here," he said, smiling as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I followed him, still questioning why I always went along with his suggestions. He shut the door behind us and began flipping through some papers on his desk. Then he opened a drawer and pulled out a small handheld camera. "I want to capture how special you are," he said, using that same soft expression he always wore to make me feel secure. I froze, staring at the camera in his hands. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't move. "It's just for us," he added, stepping closer. "I want something to remember these moments by. You trust me, don't you?" That word, trust, felt like a punch to the chest. I had spent so long convincing myself that maybe he genuinely cared about me, that I owed him for all the attention and kindness he'd given. So, I nodded. I told myself it was okay, that it wasn't a big deal. At first, it was just pictures. They weren't extreme. Just me sitting on the couch or lying on my bed, smiling awkwardly at the camera. But then he started asking me to tilt my head a certain way or adjust my shirt. "You're so beautiful," he'd say in a low, steady voice. "I just want to capture you exactly as you are." I hated how it made me feel, but I didn't know how to refuse. The first time he asked to film, I hesitated. He noticed and sat beside me, placing a hand gently on my knee. "It's okay, Leslie," he said in a soothing tone. "No one will ever see this. It's just for us. Something we can look back on when it's just the two of us." He kept talking, telling me how much he trusted me and how deeply he cared. His words chipped away at my defenses. When he finally pressed record, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I sat there, barely moving or breathing, as he spoke softly from behind the camera, telling me how perfect I was and how much he treasured me. At first, he only filmed me sitting there. Then he'd ask me to move or pose. "Just a little to the left," he'd say. "Tilt your chin up." Perfect. But it didn't stop there. He began filming more intimate moments, convincing me it was still just our secret. "This is for us," he'd say. "To remember how much we mean to each other." Each time I wanted to say no, but the words caught in my throat. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't as bad as it felt, that maybe this was normal. But it never felt normal. It felt wrong, suffocating. Yet, I didn't know how to make it stop. The camera became another way for him to control me. I started noticing how often he'd bring it out, setting it up even when I wasn't expecting it. Once, I told him I wasn't comfortable and didn't want to do it anymore. His demeanor shifted, not with anger, but something far more unsettling. He leaned in close and said, "Leslie, you don't want anyone to see what we've already done, do you? These are private, for us, but if someone else saw them, it wouldn't be good." That's when it hit me. I wasn't just stuck in a nightmare. He held the power to ruin me. We lived in a small town, and I knew exactly what would happen if those videos ever surfaced. The shame, the whispers, the way people would look at me, I couldn't bear it. So I nodded and went along with it, even though every time the red light on that camera blinked, I felt like I was suffocating. From that moment, the camera wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon, a constant reminder that I couldn't escape, that I couldn't say no even if I wanted to. And every time I saw it, I felt a piece of myself slip away. It didn't happen all at once. It crept in slowly, like a fog I couldn't escape. At first, I thought I could handle it, that I could separate what Harvey was doing from how I felt. But the weight of it began to crush me. I stopped replying to texts from friends. When they asked me to hang out, I'd make excuses. "I'm busy," "I'm tired," or "maybe another time." Eventually, they stopped asking. School became unbearable. I'd sit in class staring at the clock, counting the minutes until I could leave. But I didn't want to go home either. The thought of being near Harvey made my skin crawl, yet the alternative, being out in public where someone might ask questions, felt just as bad. I started skipping school more often, spending hours wandering aimlessly around town or hiding in the library where no one would bother me. I couldn't focus on homework. I couldn't bring myself to care about tests or grades. Then the nightmares started. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, shaking as images of Harvey's face and the blinking red light of the camera haunted me. I'd hear his voice in my head. "This is just for us." I began dreading sleep, but staying awake felt just as unbearable. The constant exhaustion dragged me deeper into a hole I couldn't climb out of. I thought about telling Harvey I couldn't do it anymore, that I needed it to stop. But every time I tried, his voice echoed in my mind. "You don't want anyone to see these, do you?" The threat wasn't loud or angry. It was calm, deliberate, and terrifying. He didn't need to raise his voice to make his point. The idea of those videos becoming public was enough to keep me quiet. I pictured the entire town knowing. I imagined my classmates laughing, my teachers looking at me with pity. I thought about my mom finding out, not just about the videos, but about everything. The shame was unbearable. The first time I tried to pull away, I told him I needed space. I said I was stressed about school and just needed time to myself. He smiled like he could see right through me. "You know I'll always be here for you," he said, his tone smooth and comforting. Then he leaned in closer and added, "But remember, Leslie, we have to protect each other. If anyone finds out about us, well, it wouldn't just be me they'd blame." His words hit me like a slap. He wasn't just threatening to ruin me, he was making sure I knew I'd be trapped forever. He made it sound like I'd be equally to blame, like speaking up would destroy my own life. After that, I gave up trying. I felt like I was suffocating, but I couldn't see a way out. Every time he touched me or whispered those sickly sweet words, it felt like I was sinking deeper into a pit I couldn't escape. I started blaming myself, wondering if I had somehow led him on, if this was my fault for not stopping him earlier. I replayed every moment in my mind, searching for where I had gone wrong, but the guilt never went away. The worst part was how it affected the way I saw my mom. Every time I looked at her, I felt an overwhelming wave of guilt. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve me. She worked so hard to hold everything together, and I was betraying her in the worst way imaginable. I wanted to tell her, but I froze every time I thought about it. What could I even say? That her husband wasn't who she thought he was? That I had let this go on for years without saying anything? The fear of how she might react, what she might say or do, kept me silent. I began to convince myself that no one would ever understand. Who could I turn to? My friends? They'd probably think I was lying, or worse, that I had wanted it. A teacher? They'd call the police, and then the whole town would know. I'd become the girl who ruined her family, the girl who couldn't keep her stepdad away. Even if someone believed me, what could they do? Harvey had the videos, he had all the power, and I had nothing. Every day felt heavier than the last. I'd sit in my room staring at the walls, wishing I could disappear. I stopped eating, stopped caring about anything. My mom started noticing then. She'd ask if I was okay, but her questions felt half-hearted, like she was asking out of obligation. "I'm fine," I'd say, forcing a smile. She'd nod and return to whatever she was doing, and the weight of my lies pressed down on me even harder. There were moments when I thought about running away, packing a bag and leaving in the middle of the night. But where would I go? Even if I left, what would stop Harvey from releasing the videos out of spite? He'd find a way to ruin me no matter what I did. I felt trapped, like I was living someone else's nightmare. The worst part was not knowing if I'd ever wake up. It all became too much to bear. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine while I was drowning inside. My grades were slipping, my friends were gone, and my mom, Maria, began to notice. At first, it was just small comments. "You've been so quiet lately," or "Is everything okay at school?" I'd brush her off with a quick, "I'm fine," but I could see the concern in her eyes. One night, I caught her standing in my doorway, looking at me like she wanted to say something, but didn't know how. I was sitting at my desk, staring blankly at an open notebook, pretending to study. "You know you can talk to me, right?" she finally said, her voice soft and hesitant. I wanted to tell her everything in that moment, but the words caught in my throat. How could I tell her that the man she trusted, the man she loved, wasn't who she thought he was? Instead, I nodded and muttered, "I know." She stood there a moment longer before walking away, and the crushing weight of guilt settled over me all over again. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve to have her life torn apart, but I didn't know what else to do. Then came the breaking point. Harvey's threats had been getting more aggressive. One day after I told him I didn't want to be alone with him anymore, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through the videos. "You sure about that, Leslie?" he said, his tone cold and calculating. "You wouldn't want anyone to see these, would you?" That was the moment I realized I couldn't keep this secret any longer. I had to find a way out, no matter how terrified I was. I started thinking about how to tell my mom, but every time I imagined her face, hurt, angry, betrayed, I froze. What if she didn't believe me? What if she blamed me? What if Harvey convinced her I was lying? The doubt swirled in my head, paralyzing me. One night, I decided to write her a letter. I thought it was the only way I could get everything out without breaking down. I poured my heart onto the page, explaining everything, how it started, how I felt trapped, and how I needed her help but didn't know how to ask. I left the letter on the kitchen counter before going to bed, my hands shaking the entire time. The next morning, the letter was gone, but Maria didn't say a word. My heart sank. Did she read it? Did Harvey find it first? The uncertainty was unbearable. I spent the entire day on edge, waiting for something to happen, but everything remained eerily normal. That night, I realized I couldn't wait for her to figure it out on her own. I had to make her see. So I did something I never thought I'd do. I sent her an email. I attached screenshots of Harvey's texts and photos of the gifts he'd given me, hoping it would be enough to make her believe me. I hit send and stared at the screen, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. Now, I'm here, sharing this story with you because I don't know what will happen next. I need your help. If you've ever been in a situation like mine, or if you know someone who has, please tell me what you did. Did you find a way out? How did you make people believe you? I feel so alone, but I know I'm not the only one. There have to be others out there who have felt the same way. If you're watching this and feel as lost as I do, maybe we can figure it out together. Maybe sharing this story will help someone else find the courage to speak up. Maybe it will help me find the strength to keep going. I don't know what's going to happen when my mom reads that email, but I know I can't keep living like this. Please, if this story resonates with you, share it. Someone out there might need to hear it just as much as I needed to say it. And if you have advice, anything, I'm begging you to leave a comment. Sometimes it feels like there's no way out, but maybe together, we can find one.